In his seminal work, Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl writes, "There is one universal truth beholden to all mankind, and that is the freedom to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances." What gives Frankl the gumption to make such a bold claim? Well, he wrote Man's Search for Meaning after spending a number of years interned in a Nazi concentration camp. And it was during his internment that Frankl discovered what led to one's survival more often than not was not their color, their creed, their health, nor their wealth. What led to one's survival was the attitude they chose about the situation they're in. Fellow Toastmasters and guests, I, like Frankl too, believe that the quality of our lives is determined not by what happens to us, but the quality of our lives is determined by the meaning we choose about what happens to us. And in a moment, I want to share with you a story about one of the most inspiring people I know and the choices he's made. But before I get to that, I have a favor to ask of all of you. If you'd be so kind to sit up nice and tall in your chair, take a deep breath in, and close your eyes. As you sit here with your eyes closed, imagine, if you will, what a typical day in your life is like. And notice what comes to mind. Perhaps you see yourself out enjoying a meal out, connecting with friends. Perhaps your day is made more meaningful by being able to hug and hold close those whom you care about the most, your children and your grandchildren. I want you to hold this image in your head as I ask one final favor. Imagine, if you will, what this day would be like if you're no longer able to physically do all the things that you do. Imagine, if you will, what your days would be like if you're no longer able to take a full breath of air in because the muscles of your lungs had started to lose function. Imagine, if you will, what your days would be like if you're no longer able to use the muscles of your hands to feed yourself at a meal out with friends. And imagine, if you will, what your days would be like if you're no longer able to use the muscles of your arms and torso to hug and hold close those whom you care about the most, like your children and your grandchildren. I want you to notice how you feel and remember this feeling as you sit back in your chairs, open your eyes, and listen to my story about my friend Johnny. Quick background about Johnny. He was born and raised in Texas, and every bit of a man's man from Texas. He grew up a cowboy riding horses, and eventually moved to Santa Barbara, where he played and coached football, and began to work as a cowboy chef, where he shared two of his greatest passions with people: good food and good wine. This is how Johnny lived his life up until late 2014, and that's when things changed. It was at this time that Johnny had been noticing he was having difficulty doing some fundamental things like opening and closing lids. He thought that perhaps it was a byproduct of a recent surgery. But after doctor and specialist after specialist came back with, "We don't know," Johnny began to think that maybe he was imagining it in his head. That is until his doctor decided to run one final test. When she delivered the results, she had tears in her eyes as she looked at Johnny and she said, "I'm sorry." "I'm sorry," she said. "The test came back positive. You have ALS." What is ALS, also known as Lou Gehrig's disease? The Cliff Notes version: it's a neuromuscular disease that causes your muscles to atrophy and cease to function. For most, the diagnosis is terminal. What would you do if you were told you were going to die? More specifically, what would you do if you were told that the way you were going to die is that day by day, hour by hour, minute by minute, you were going to lose the physical ability to do the things that most of us believe give our lives meaning? Let me tell you what Johnny did. He got angry. He got scared. He began bargaining with God, wondering what he had done to deserve such a fate. And that's when the light bulb went off. Like Frankl years before him, Johnny realized that he too had a choice. He could choose to allow ALS to define the remainder of his life, or he could choose how he wanted to define the remainder of his life. And it was at that time that Johnny made the decision to choose to see his diagnosis of ALS as a gift. A gift that he'd been given, in his words, to spread the gospel of ALS to anyone who would listen. A gift that he'd been given to raise awareness about the insidiousness of the disease and to inspire others to live and to live with dignity. And inspire he has, because at a time in his life when he's no longer able to take a full breath of air, and because the muscles of his lungs have started to lose function, he's found new ways to enjoy the simple things in life, like watching his hummingbirds fly by. And at a time in his life when he's no longer able to use the muscles of his hand to cook and let alone feed himself, he's found new ways to connect with his friends. And at a time in his life when he's no longer able to use the muscles of his arms and torso to hug and hug close those who he cares about the most, he's made it his absolute mission to let everyone know how much he loves them. The result of all this? If Johnny were standing in front of you today, he would look each and every one of you in the eye, and he would say, "The last 2 years living with ALS have been hard, make no mistake about it, but they've been the happiest 2 years of my life. The happiest 2 years of my life. How is it possible that a man's man from Texas gets a terminal diagnosis that day by day, hour by hour, minute by minute, robs him of the physical ability to do the things that most of us believe give our life meaning, and yet he's able to live the happiest 2 years of his life?" They answer, because the quality of our lives is determined not by what happens to us. The quality of our lives is determined by the meaning we choose about what happens to us. I spoke with Johnny a few days ago, and as he asked me what I had going on the rest of the day, I immediately looked at my watch and began reciting the busyness of the day, at which point he paused me. He said, "Jesse, remember something. When you look at a clock, that's not just time ticking off a clock. That's time ticking off your life." Fellow Toastmasters and guests, as cliche as it sounds, we all know that we're not promised anything beyond right now. Which means that if you're fortunate enough to receive more time on your clock, I encourage each and every one of you to do as Johnny has and choose to receive that time as a gift. Thank you.